Bonnie. Bonnie, you're a celebrity. Come here.
Is that right? Oh my gosh, I'll introduce you. Not really. Not really. Oh my gosh, Tom. Yeah, how are you doing? Good to see you. How's everything? Oh my gosh, I feel pretty good. It's been a little while since I've seen everybody. Anyone back again? They had a big hurricane. A big hurricane. It was like a rainstorm.
Actually, I heard your mom's little place.
Kyle?
Yeah.
Kevin, we went to Holy Cross.
Oh, it's your Holy Cross, guys. Come on, guys. Kevin McDermott. Actually, I was going to say for Hunt, you knew about this situation. I can see you later on.
James is his book. Oh, look at that. No. Give me 1 second, I'm gonna pause the stream.
Yeah, the Holy Cross connect. The Holy Cross connect.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're live streaming this event, so there are these last minute little kinks we're ironing out, but we're ready to go. My name is Miriam Nigan-Gray, and I'm the Associate Director and Director of Graduate Studies here at Luxman Ireland House. Welcome to you all first for our return visitors and to our first visitors here to our wonderful Centre for Irish and Irish American Studies. I won't belabor any introduction outside of saying that we're so honoured to have Dan Barry and Alice McDermott here this evening. I'm going to hand over to Dan to formally introduce Alice. And if I could just ask you to silence your cell phones, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Dan Barry.
Thanks very much. Keep the microphone high for you. Can you hear me all right? Yes. All right. So let me start by asking you a question. What writer would be daring enough to produce a novel in which the... Let me start by asking a question. What writer would be daring enough to produce a novel in which the protagonists, the heroines even, are nuns? Who else would save nuns from easy caricature and cartoonish portrayals, from Cheech and Chong jokes and Sister Acts 1 and 2? Who else would present the nuns as full-blooded human beings with complex backstories and motivations, as people worthy of serious consideration and, in my estimation, of deep admiration? And who else would choose, of all the religious orders, the Little Sisters of the Poor, whose very name in these cynical days also sounds like a punchline? The Little Sisters of the Poor, the order that finds meaning in spirituality and hospitality, that begs for money to help others. Who else would be the writer to elevate nuns, to elevate the Little Sisters of the Poor by conveying their humanity, and doing so with glorious literature? Who else but Alice McDermott, of course. It has been my honor and Alice's burden to introduce her on a couple of previous occasions. And the truth is, I've exhausted my supply of superlatives in describing her body of work. We are both Irish Catholics from Long Island. You can hear that in my voice, perhaps. Which means, among other things, that we are both discerning in what brand of industrial baked goods we choose to eat. Entenmann's. Everybody. Industrial baked goods. But the similarities pretty much end there. Alice ranks in the upper echelons of novelists in the world. Time and again, she has taken the small moments in a circumscribed community, working class Irish Americans, living and striving in the metropolitan area, and revealed the universe. That night, at weddings and wakes, after this, Charming Billy, Someone. You know these works. No doubt you too have finished Someone, put it down, and felt the wonder of the achievement. It was as though she watched the evening flow of humanity belching out of a subway station in Brooklyn, or off a Long Island Railroad train in Babylon, picked a person at random and said, you, Marie Comerford, your life matters. Your life is an epic. Your pent-up desires, your failures, your smallest moments, they matter, and you matter. And if I did not hate Alice enough, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, did I say hate? I mean, and if I did not envy Alice enough, is that better? Now here she comes with an absolutely exquisite addition to her impressive canon, The Ninth Hour. I read the first chapter about a suicide and a pregnant widow and an old, determined force of nature who happens to be a nun, and I had to put the book down to take it all in. I turned to my wife, Mary, and she said, I know. Somehow, Alice gathers together a milkman and a doorman and a pregnant widow and a young mother with a large brood and an invalid and a Civil War veteran, yes, a Civil War veteran, and nuns, many nuns, and the Brooklyn of another time, and explains the world for all. She does not pretty things up. There is pain and betrayal and spiritual doubt and sexual repression, of course, and manic depression and excrement under the fingernails, and the eternal, often maddening quest to feel connected to something larger than ourselves. But there is also love, pure, abiding, hard-tested love. In the end, that is what saves us. It is our salvation. So, who would be the writer to convey this essential truth with keenly felt, bulletproof sentences, one after another and another? Who else? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alice McDermott.
Good night. Thank you, Dan. As always, boy, your introductions are getting better. Thank you so much for the really kind and beautiful words, and for once again taking on this task. I'm just going to give you a little sample from the Ninth Hour, and since it is indeed, I apologize, it is a book with lots of nuns in it. My own notebook that I kept while writing this book is just full of the word nuns with question marks after it. Who would do that? Why would anyone do that? The nun that I found most difficult to write about and to understand is actually probably the best nun in the book. You know, bad nuns, easy. We got bad nuns. But Sister Jean is, she's a young nun at the beginning of the novel and stays around into her old age throughout the novel. She is someone who absolutely, thoroughly believes in the promise of her faith, that Christ has died so that she will live. She believes in paradise. She believes in heaven, eternal life. That was really hard for me to give the my full attention to someone who believes this so thoroughly. So I thought I would read a brief section that, if I can tell you the behind-the-scenes story, this was my attempt to figure out what this faithful nun was thinking. She is indeed a little sister. This is the order is a made-up order. It's an amalgam of the Little Sisters, Nursing Sisters, the Sister Saviors, a combination of a number of nuns, mostly the Little Sisters and the Nursing Sisters of the Congregation of the Infant Jesus, both of whom were in New York at the time. The orders didn't really fit my purposes, so I realized I had to found my own. So I called them the Little Nursing Sisters of the Sick Poor Congregation of Mary Before the Cross. Which gave me all kinds of freedom from history itself. So Sister Jean is indeed a nursing sister. And here's her portrait. Every child delighted Sister Jean. She was a practical nurse without formal training, and what skills she had were sometimes limited by her size and her strength. But her way with children was astonishing. Perhaps because even in full habit she seemed to be one of them, small and soft-spoken and easily given to laughter or tears, but also with a kind of sly skepticism in her eyes whenever she raised her chin to attend to some tall adult. A skepticism it seemed only the children could perceive and share. Sister Jean need only turn her face from some serious, long-winded grown-up, a parent, a priest, a doctor, even one of the other nuns, to the child in the room, and some understanding was established. It's all silliness, isn't it? Her eyes alone could convey, let's not let them know, we know. Didn't she do as much for us? Because of her small size and her talent with little ones, more often than not, the casework Sister Jean was given was very sad. Sick children, failing newborns, toddlers neglected or abused or abandoned. Her expertise was in the eradication of scabies, ringworm, lice, the application of castor oil and poultices, the cleaning of ears, and the soothing of tears. Sister Jean knew the route to the various Brooklyn orphanages or to the Foundling Home in Manhattan better than any of the others. It was often her task to accompany the children there, sometimes from the gate of the cemetery, sometimes from the court or the station house, sometimes from the very room where the poor mother, newly cold, still lay, the gamey odor of death already encroaching on the still air. Out on the street with her charges, Sister Jean could make the trip an enchantment for the trembling little ones, pulling sugar cubes from her deep pockets or leaning down to point out something or someone that would make them laugh. She could negotiate the subway stairs in the crowded streets with a sleeping newborn tucked into the crook of her arm, and always, always, the sister who accompanied her would report to the others, Sister Jean made the trip back to the convent in snuffling tears. Sister Jean believed, with the conviction of an eyewitness, that all human loss would be restored. The grieving child would have her mother again. The dead infant would find robust health. Suffering, sorrow, accident, and loss would all be amended in heaven. She believed this because, and she only possessed the wherewithal to explain this to children, trying to say it to angry or grieving or bitter adults only left her tongue-tied, because fairness demanded it. It was, to her mind, a simple proposition. The madness with which suffering was dispersed in the world defied logic. There was nothing else like it for unevenness, bad luck, bad health, bad timing. Innocent children were afflicted as often as bad men. Young mothers were struck down even as old ones fretfully lingered. Good lives ended in confusion or despair or howling devastation. The fortunate went blissfully about their business until that moment when fortune vanished. A knock on the door, a cough, a knife flash, a brief bit of inattention. A much longed for baby slid into the world only to grow blue and limp in its mother's arms. Another arrived lame or ill-formed or simply too hungry for a frail woman already overwhelmed. There was a child in the next parish with a skull so twisted his mouth couldn't close, and every breath he took, every word he spoke, even his childish laughter, rattled through dry and swollen lips. Another with a birthmark like a purple caul, blindness, beatings, broken or bent bones, accident, decay, cruelty of nature, cruelty of bad men, idiocy, madness. There was no accounting for it, no accounting for how general it was, how arbitrary. Sister Jean believed that fairness demanded this chaos be righted. Fairness demanded that grief should find succor, that wounds should heal, insult and confusion find recompense and certainty, that every living person God had made should not willy-nilly be forever unmade. You know what's fair and what isn't, don't you? Sister Jean would ask the sick child, the grieving orphan, Sally herself, when she was old enough to understand the question, and us. And how do you know? Sister Jean would put a fingertip to the child's forehead, to the child's beating heart, because God put the knowledge in you before you were born, so you would know fairness when you see it, so you would know He intends to be fair. Who's the dumbest boy in your class? She once asked us. This was in the Hempstead house where we were young. And if the teacher's dividing up sweets and gives him only one while everyone else gets two, what will he say? He'll say it's not fair, won't he? If you call him out playing ball and everyone can see he's safe by a mile, what will he say? Dumb as he is in school, he'll say it's not fair, see? And how does he know? Did he learn what's fair from a book? Did he take a test? No, he did not. Thank you.
So this will be like Rowan and Martin here. We'll just do a couple of questions, and then maybe you'll read some more. How about that?
Okay.
Would that be good?
Sure.
So I'm going to ask you, why nuns? Why?
All right. How much time have we got?
Well, that's it. You know, and how much exposure did you have growing up and even in your adult life with nuns?
Sure. Yeah, a little background. This novel, the seeds for this novel, every novel has a different genesis. I'm sure every story, every column has a different genesis. This novel began after a conversation I had over dinner and drinks with a dear friend, a lawyer and an amateur historian, who mentioned this was some years ago when we could have conversations in DC that didn't have anything to do with the T word. So we were just talking about things, and he had this recollection that somewhere in his family there had been an old man who lived in an old house that an aunt or an uncle lived, who had served as substitute in the Civil War for one of his relatives. And so we talked about this notion of substitutes in the Civil War, this time when you could pay someone, a family or someone of means could pay another young man or even not so young to go off and join the army in his place. And I don't know why that stayed with me. I'd heard about it before, I think, but I started reading about it and looking at the history of it. And not being a historian or a reporter or a journalist, the more I read about it and saw how it worked in history and thought about it, I found myself obviously looking for the metaphor in it. That you go, this life is either more valuable than yours, or maybe you are generous enough to say, I will put myself at risk for you. There's all kinds of reasons. And I started thinking about, well, then how long do you have to stay grateful for the guy who went? You know, do you have to remember him 2-3 generations later? Because if the guy who stayed is able to reproduce, then each generation should really be grateful to the guy who went. Obviously, I'm sure you're all thinking the same thing. We sort of have a substitute military right now. They go. There's a lot of conversation about this lately. We stay. We live you put yourselves at risk. You can't be a Catholic and think about those things and not come quickly to He who died so that we may live. I thought the way into the story was, or I learned as I wrote it, the way into the story was not through the substitute in the Civil War, as much as he fascinated me, and maybe not even through someone who is selfless. I thought that that Emily Dickinson idea of tell all the truth but tell it slant, that maybe I should begin the novel with someone who is entirely selfless, selfish. What's the opposite of I will give my life so that you may live? Well, that may be somebody who says, it's my life, I claim it, and I don't care about anyone else. And I thought, an argument could be made that suicide is, could be interpreted as that moment when you say, this is just me, not you. So I began the novel with a suicide, with a young Irish immigrant, claiming his time by taking it. But then he had a pregnant wife, and they lost their means of support, and there was no social safety net. And Sister Saint Savior, this nun who just finished begging at the Woolworths at Borough Hall. There never was a Woolworths at Borough, but in my New York, in my Brooklyn, there is a Woolworths at Borough Hall in 1910. She showed up. She showed up. Who else would be there to take over, to take care of this family? And I killed her off. At the end, at the end of the first chapter, it's like, oh no books about nuns. But she had already invited 2 more nuns in before she left. The nuns took over, and that's when I realized that's what I had.
So when you began, you were focusing on the conscription issue, the $300, which I think Peter Quinn talks about in Down
Yes,
Eve as well.
Right.
And then you think about the opposite of that equation, that being someone who would take his life, and then in your imagination, a nun walks in?
Well, it was circumstantial. It's also circumstantial because, well, who would have been there?
Right.
Who would have been there to take over, to take care? And I think, it wasn't a complete surprise. I don't want to make this sound too from the Holy Spirit, but knowing what the community was like, knowing what the world was like, and having in my own background, and this is something that I hadn't thought about consciously until I was telling the story. My mother was raised in Brooklyn by a widowed aunt. And she told wonderfully fond stories about Sister Mary Rose, who was indeed a nursing sister in the Confraternity of the Infant Jesus, who was there, babysitter, house cleaner, bring food, a working mother in the early part of the 20th century in a poor immigrant neighborhood. When she had to go off to work, who was there if the kids got sick? And so I was aware that there were such nuns. But when they came into the story, I realized that they were very much about this initial intent, about the value of selflessness.
Right.
Yeah.
So you fooled me, because I've written about the Little Sisters of the Poor,
Yes.
and so you created your own order. Good for you. And one of the characters, Sister Jean, in fact, tells the story of the foundress of that order, and so you suckered me.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I until this moment, I thought there was a Woolworths in Borough Hall.
Power.
But you also are very specific about their habits, the wimples, the cleaning, the use of alum, their rhythms. How much research did you do? Now, I've spoken to you before about your liberal use of imagination. Like in Someone, you described the protagonist going into a subway station where there is none, or you imagined it. You didn't go there to do the research. Like when I write a story, I go and I write everything down.
So you have so much more fun.
No, I think it might be more fun to make it all up, honestly. So how do you do the research, or did you do research for your immersion into the world of religious order?
And I did. I read a lot of histories of religious orders, and I mean I have to have the voice. I have to have character, a sense of the story, certainly a sense of the storyteller within the story, before I do any research. I have to see what I need and who's going to make use of it. So when I realized I had these nuns, and the nuns had taken over this young widow's life and would take over the life of her unborn child, and they were going to be around for a while. So I began simply just reading histories of various orders. And I have to say, because, as you noted, I love the name of the Little Sisters of the Poor, and there's so many fabulous names. If there's one thing that I'm ever grateful for being Catholic for, is that we've got great words. You know, we've got great. So I mean, just that idea of an order of women coming together in religious community and choosing. They naming themselves the Little Sisters of the Sick Poor. So you have all that, at the beginning of the name, you have all that humility. We're just little, we're sisters, we're not fathers, can't be fathers, you know. We're just little, we're just humble, of the sick poor, and we are going to end suffering in the world. So you have this humility at the beginning of the name, and this tremendous hubris at the end of it. And you don't have to think about that too long to think, who were these women? Did they see that? They must have seen themselves that way. No credit, we're just going to go around and do this, but we are going to stand against ignorance and ill health and poverty and loneliness. We're going to take care of that. That's our mission. I had a little bit of a bias. I did love the story of the founding of the real Little Sisters of the Poor. Jean Jugan was their founder, their French order, which I couldn't use right away because my nuns were Irish, you know, so that's out. I can't write about the French, you know. Jeez. But there is the true story of the founding. Jean Jugan was a woman in a small town in France who came upon a blind old lady who had been put out on the street, obviously to die, by her family. Jean Jugan took her in, took her home to where she lived, took care of her, gave her her own bed, nursed her, and then saw another woman and said, well, I've got one, I might as well help another. And then people started bringing their old people to her. And then other young women, seeing what she did, said, can I help out? So they formed a community to help the elderly, the abandoned elderly. And eventually they realized that they wanted to make it a religious community. So their first mistake, they called the local priest in and said, you know, we're already doing this, but we want to formalize it, and could you help us draw up all the rules of our order, and would you take it to Rome so that we can become a sanctioned religious order? And he said, certainly, and he helped them, and he went to Rome. And when he got to Rome, he said, you know, one day I found this blind old lady on the street, and I called my friend Jean Jugan, and I asked her if she would please take this woman home. And then I found another one, and then I got some, and then I founded this order. So for years, and of course, you know, the Pope said, of course you did. That's what we do, aren't we great? You know?
We men.
We men, yeah. And so the order, and then he came back, and by this time Jean Jugan was actually pretty well known in France. She was a kind of celebrity. She did receive a medal from the government, which she immediately, I love it, melted down and bought a house with. She did indeed, as Sister Jean describes it, she did meet Charles Dickens, who did describe her as the holiest woman. So she had a lot of attention in her own country. he came back and said to her, no more of this going out and collecting money for your poor people and being a celebrity. I think you need to stay in the convent, don't leave the convent, and you can be in charge of some of the novices. And she was obedient. The phrase that she used was, "You have taken my work from me, but I give it to you gladly." And she died unknown. She was just the old nun. But this guy's fatal flaw was that he replaced her with a very young nun, obviously someone he liked, to be the head of the order. And the very young nun, when she became a very old nun, wanted to get to heaven and realized that she couldn't get to heaven until she confessed and told the real story of who was the founder. So that's real. And I love the Little Sisters, and I love that story. But my character, who wanted to join this order and takes the name of Jean for Jean Jugan, is sent to the wrong convent when she begins her novitiate. The priest, he was busy, he wrote down the wrong address, and he sent her to the Little Nursing Sisters of the Sick Poor Congregation of Mary Before the Cross, the fictional one. And I have to say there was probably a little political satisfaction, because also at this time the Little Sisters in Washington, D.C. Were speaking out quite vocally against the Affordable Care Act. So I thought, well, Sister Jean is not going to be a part of that.
Speaking out against the
Against it, yes, yeah.
Screw that.
They're complicated.
But what's also interesting too is the ingratitude. In other words, these, and that's what's interesting. Interior lives of the nuns. How are they able to do this? Where they are giving themselves so selflessly, say for example to the invalid who basically tells them to go away and never shows a sign of gratitude, and yet at a crucial moment there's grace there. There's grace on behalf of the nuns, and so you're juggling both the selflessness with this hubris, as you say. It's really remarkable, and I'm sure it's worthy of exploration for you. I mean, that's what attracted you.
Yeah, well, I think, and very much as you said, it doesn't take long to realize that the work of nuns has been denigrated and almost erased from popular history and our awareness. I remember as a kid walking through Brooklyn, how many times you just saw nuns on the street, how many there were. There were thousands at one time in Brooklyn. And they have been turned into caricatures, and their work has been forgotten or denigrated. So I felt myself kind of doubling down on that, because the first work that I get to illustrate in the novel is in the laundry. Annie, the widow of the suicide, is given a job in the laundry because Sister Illuminata, see these great names we have? Sister Illuminata, the laundress, not subtle, is getting old and she needs a little bit of help. And in my convent, the laundry is down in the basement of the building, and she labors there. She was a nursing sister, but she had a bout of tuberculosis and was told not to nurse anymore. And her mother was a laundress, so she had this expertise. And that's where the fun research came in. Because as soon as I understood that, now I had to find out everything I could about how do you be an expert in laundry in the early part of the 20th century. But I knew all the research was for Sister Illuminata. I knew her character, I knew her pride in what she knew. She has a PhD in laundry. She knows everything, and she's proud of it. And she's fond of it because she's learned it from her mother, so there's that. But that also started me on the path to say, of course, every single one of these nuns is full of unique experiential and practical information. just because they all dress alike
I know.
does not mean that there should be anything monolithic about their personalities or their histories.
Or that they get along.
Or that they get along. Of course they don't get along. They're women, you know. They're human beings, never mind just women. They're human beings who are busy. They have a lot to do. They're busy, hard-working women, knowing what their task is, knowing how great the need is. They go out every day. They need the money. They need to manipulate the people around them to get the money out of them. There's a small detail that I did find in my reading that actually took place that I just loved, that the nuns in some of the Brooklyn convents would write down as a prayer things that they needed for the convent, or, you know, Dear Mother Mary, if only we could fix the boiler, thank you very much, you know. And they would slip it under the statue of the Blessed Virgin, and then the wealthier and better able Catholics in the neighborhood would go and get these prayers, and suddenly money for the boiler would show up, you know, and the nuns could say thank you, you know. So it was this, you know, smart, clever to get things done.
And where did you go? How did you Google how to clean a wimple in the early 20th century United States? Where did you find?
There's lots of wonderful things. One of the best research tools for me for this novel was reading newspapers from the era, especially the Brooklyn Eagle. Because there's so many wonderful stories, and not even looking for anything in particular, but they're advertisements. So you see, you know, how much it costs to buy a washing machine in 1922. There, in the women's pages, there are lots of laundry advice, so you could borrow some of that. I found a couple of guides for housewives that also gave all kinds of information. And again, a lot of it Sister Illuminata would not know. You know, she was not starching collars for a gentleman to go to a ball. But how do you get rid of the stain of blood mixed with phlegm? There's a way.
How do you?
There is, it's in here. It's in here. And especially for her, having had a bout of tuberculosis, so that was a found detail that I said, oh, she'll use that. That's a detail that belongs to Sister Illuminata's encyclopedic understanding of how to clean clothes.
Well, let's get off the topic of nuns, except for one more question. Were you surprised how the nuns began to insinuate the story from where you began? Were you surprised how, at least in my estimation, how powerful a presence they wind up having in the book?
Yeah, and as I say, I fought against it.
You didn't think it was marketable, or?
Just, you know, 8 novels that I have been denying with each one that I am a Catholic writer. I'm a writer. Sometimes I write about Catholic characters. Again, they have great language, but I'm not writing about the church. I'm not writing to convert or to toss anybody out. About midway through this, I thought, okay, this is a Catholic novel. I will not deny it this time. This is a Catholic. And I think it was that, and not only that they were there as a presence, you know, one of the confusing pieces of advice I give to my writing students is always make sure your story is not too much about what it's about. They love that, you know, they have no idea what that means. Right. Yeah. Well, again, it's that idea of what is apparent, and then what enters unexpectedly, both for the writer and the reader as a story is developing. So it was that not only let's give credit where credit is due, let's restore our admiration for these women, let's see their lives in a broader context than popular culture has placed them in. Yes, that's all that. But there's also, what do you do with this faith? And what do you do with, as Sister Jean knows, human suffering? What do you do with the inevitability in every single human life for suffering? And that's when you say, that's what it's really about. That's what the novel is really becoming about. Which life is given up for what life, but also not just do we remember through the generations, but are they wrong to expect a reward?
Right.
Are they wrong to and how do you define selflessness? Does a reward have to be in there? I was talking today with some people again about my students. Even marvelous millennials will come in sometime to my office and they'll say, next year I'm going to go and I'm going to join Teach for America and I'm going to teach for 2 years in some urban school, or I'm going to go to Africa or South America and I'm going to work with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and I love it, and I love you kids, that's great, but almost every time at some point in the conversation they say, and it will look really good on my resume. And I've often thought, what would they think of me? What would their parents think of me if I said, how about you do that and never tell anybody about it? How about you go off and do this wonderful work for a year or two of your life and then come back and don't put it on your resume. Don't say that I've done this. You'd be nuts, I mean, but that would be selfless. So what is the value of selfless? Where do we draw the line between reasonable selflessness and that's nuts? You're crazy. Why would you do that? And does selflessness have to have a reward to make it something less than crazy? And in the Christian tradition, it does. Christ on the cross at just before the 9th hour, the 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour in the Christian tradition where Christ died, in the Old Testament tradition, the hour of sacrifice. Right before that, he turns to the good thief and he says, this day you will be with me in paradise. Just hold on. You'll get through this suffering, and then it will be great. So I started thinking, what if one of these selfless nuns was so selfless that she would give up even that? That she would say, and even that reward, that she would thoroughly believe in, because of fairness, because of that, her own religious logic. What would be the circumstance that would make her give not just her life for her friends, but her eternal life for her friends? And that became, for me, what the novel became about.
That's right. It's very powerful. Why don't I get out of the way and you read something else? All right. Alice McDermott.
Let's see. Well, since I was mentioning all the good words, Sally, who is the unborn child in the first chapter, when her father commits suicide, becomes the convent child. Her mother goes to work in the laundry, and it's great because you can bring your child to work when you work in a laundry in a convent. So she's more or less raised in the convent by the nuns, by Sister Illuminata in particular. And when she hits high school, she decides that she has a vocation as well. Now she's described as sort of what my mother would have called a flibbertigiit. She loves to try on the donated clothes, for instance, and she loves to mimic all her classmates, and she brings the joy and humor to the laundry when she comes home from school. So her mother knows that what she really likes is she likes the clothes that the nuns wear. She doesn't necessarily have a vocation, but there's a debate in the convent about Sally's vocation. So I'll just read because, again, this is found poetry, the language of our church. These lines are good. There were the little sisters of the sick poor, the little sisters of the Assumption, the nursing sisters of the sick poor of the congregation of the infant Jesus, the sisters of the poor of St. Francis, the Dominican sisters of the sick poor of the Immaculate Conception, the poor Clares, the little company of Mary. There were the sisters of divine compassion, of divine providence, of the Sacred Heart. There were the little nursing sisters of the sick poor of the congregation of Mary before the cross, Stabat Mater, their own order. But there are also the daughters of wisdom, the daughters of charity, the sisters of charity, the Benedictine sisters, the sisters of St. Joseph, the sisters of reparation of the congregation of Mary. There were the gray nuns of the Sacred Heart, the visitation nuns, the presentation nuns, the handmaids of the Holy Child, the sister servants of the Holy Spirit. Sister Eugenia admired the Sisters of Mercy. Their foundress, like our own, she told Annie, as if courting her native pride, was an Irish woman, a daughter of wealth, called by God to serve the sick poor, first in Dublin, then all over Ireland, England, and America. A wonderful order, Sister Eugenia said. She named the hospitals they ran, the schools, the very sanatorium upstate where Sister Illuminata had been cured. Sister Joseph Mary, who kept the convent's small library, mentioned St. Rose's free home for incurable cancer, right across the river and run by the Dominican Sisters of St. Rose of Lima. Their founder was the daughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne, Sister Joseph Mary said proudly. Not a Catholic himself, she explained to Annie, but a great writer nonetheless. And wasn't there wonderful work being done for the lepers in Hawaii by the Sisters of St. Francis out of Syracuse? Sister Dimphna kept a scrapbook of inspirational things. Annie was shown a folded newspaper clipping that mentioned Mother Mary Ann Cope. Most of the article was about Father Damien, the priest to the lepers who had first invited the sisters to Molokai. But Sister Dimphna had underlined in black ink every good word about the nun. There was a photo of a young girl with leprosy. She had a ruined face, a monstrous face, but she wore a cunning skirt and jacket as good as you'd see on Fifth Avenue. All Mother Mary Ann's doing, the article said. The nun, the article said, had a flair for fashion. Wouldn't Annie be proud to see her own child bringing beauty to these suffering souls? A consensus arose among the sisters in the convent, perhaps because they had seen the girl helping Sister Illuminata up and down the basement stair, that Sally would do well with the old folks. The French Little Sisters of the Poor, the Otter Sister Jean herself had once intended to join, did marvelous work in this regard. And the Sisters of Charity had a home for aged domestic workers, immigrants mostly, men and women who had outlived their usefulness and their employers' largesse, faithful servants of the city's faithless titans. Wouldn't Sally be great with them? Or indigent widows, the Carmelites were mentioned. They had a place on Staten Island. And then there were the missionary orders to consider, the foreign missions of St. Dominic, the missionary sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, of Our Lady of Victory, of the Most Precious Blood. There were the charity nuns as well, who seemed to be everywhere doing everything. There were the teaching orders. There were the contemplatives and cloistered, although none of the nuns in the convent believed that such a life would suit Sally, who, they had observed, still fidgeted in the chapel, played with her hair at Sunday Mass, who, even now, despite her call, had to be hushed by her mother when her giddy laughter rose up the basement stairs. One of the walking orders, then, like their own, an order that would get her out among the poor, out in the air. She might help to care for orphans, childlike as she was. The Sisters of Charity ran the Foundling Home in Manhattan. Aren't they a busy bunch? Annie asked Mrs. Tierney. Given her youth and her innocence, her spark of mischief, Sally might, as a sister, inspire and uplift certain fallen women. The Good Shepherd Sisters had a place for them. Give her to the prostitutes, Annie told her friend Mrs. Tierney. Send her to China or Africa or to Hawaii with the lepers. That's what they're proposing. Let her work in an orphanage, they're saying, after everything I've done to keep her out of one. When Sally's high school days were drawing to a close, Sister Lucy ran her yellow eyes over the girl and told Annie, let her follow me for the week. Let her get a glimpse of the work. On that early morning in June, mother and daughter entered the convent through the front door rather than the back. They waited for a moment, feeling like visitors in the hushed hallway until Sister Lucy swung toward them, sweeping down the corridor from the kitchen. She wore her cloak and carried her black satchel. She produced a white postulant's veil. Wear this, Sister Lucy said. You don't want to look like a tourist. And smiled thinly at her own joke. Come with me, she said. Annie helped her daughter fasten the veil and then kissed the smooth top of it as she sent her off. Sally took small, hurried steps, following behind Sister Lucy as if a long skirt bound her ankles, not her own gait at all. Her mother wondered which of the nuns she was imitating now. She turned. Sister Illuminata was there in the hallway, standing before the basement door, leaning on her cane. Baptism by fire, Sister Illuminata said.
Have we got enough out of you, or do we have time for a bit of Q&A, or no? Does anyone have any quick questions, or? Yes, sir.
Or a comment, Tom Miles, and I've known Alice for a long time.
See, it's a plant.
I've had nuns in my family for 85 years. My aunt and my sister, Josephites, and just as the characters in your book, so compassionate, and I know their humanity, and I can say, when I was going through a difficult divorce, these two people were more for me than anybody else in the family. But what I was struck about your book is, particularly my aunt, I was her chauffeur many times, and I would bring her back to the convent, and it would end at the door. But this book, you opened the door of the convent and let us in. So I thank you, and thank you for the great portrayal of the nuns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's better than a question.
Joanne, there, have you one?
Yeah, I'm not sure, I didn't read the book yet, so I apologize, but what did you learn about, here I am an Irish studies student here, grad student. What did you learn about the Irish in Brooklyn? Kind of not separate from the nuns, but in addition to the nuns, that you felt was something you didn't know, even having grown up with, or your mother having grown up with. What were some of the things that were new to you?
I don't know if you heard that. The question is, what did I discover writing this book about the Irish in Brooklyn? That was new to me. I'm not really interested in the Irish. They just show up. One bit of, and this may apply somewhat to the Irish, because there was certainly, in the reading that I did, in newspapers of the era, there were certainly lots of Irish names, but Italian and Polish and all the things that you would expect. But one thing that I read sort of after the fact, after I had written a good part of it, certainly I'd already written the first chapter, was how many articles I stumbled across about mostly men dying because of a gas leak in their apartments or even in their homes. And some of them were described as suicides, and some of them were described as accidents. But there were an astonishing number of them. And so as I was coming towards the end of the book, and I was a little bit nervous about opening a book with a suicide, especially with the way people of this era viewed suicide. I mean, the main thing about the suicide in that first chapter is that Annie knows she cannot bury her husband in a Catholic cemetery, the Catholic cemetery that they already bought the plot for, because apparently people did that. They, Catholics, I don't think it was just the Irish. You get married and the next thing you do is you go buy that cemetery plot. We are taking till death do us part, really. We know exactly where we're going. Really, it should not have fallen away. We should do that more at weddings. Here's your Nespresso, and here's your cemetery plot. You're done. So there was, there was that Catholic, the interest that I had in, again, a rule that the Catholic Church held tightly to until they realized it was wrong. And they changed it, and nobody complained, and we didn't have a rash of suicides in the Catholic Church because that threat of not being able to be buried in the Catholic Church kept depressed people living. I don't think so. So for me, it's just maybe pointing out that there are lots of things that the Catholic Church was wrong about that they were able to gracefully change as the world changed. And maybe all these women who were doing all this work, just the fact that despite their brilliance and their determination and their incredible faith, that they cannot be priests in the church they've given their life to, maybe that's also something that could just be changed, and it's not going to be that bad. We can only hope. But there was that incredible. I later found out that the people who write, serious people, scientists and doctors who write about suicide in the 21st century, have pointed out that it's always an impulsive act. That even if people talk about it and plan it, and the act itself is always considered impulsive. And it seemed to me that maybe that was the means at hand. Close up your small apartment and turn on the gas was just like having a gun in the house. Again, I don't think that's just Irish, but it was a peculiar thing to discover about that time.
One of the questions I had when I was reading the book was that you talk about the bouts of depression that Sally had later in life.
Yes.
And I wondered if that was something that you felt was inherited from her father, or the fact that, she was always torn between the vocation and getting married. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I guess that was a way to acknowledge that we have changed the way we talk about things. So for the narrators of the story who are in the 21st century, they understand that was mental illness, that's depression, or manic depression in some cases. For the generation before them, their mother is melancholic. She has melancholy, or is another phrase would be he's shell-shocked. He came back from the war and he's shell-shocked. And for the generation before that, this is going back to the beginnings of the book, he was peculiar. And in some ways, the 21st century diagnosis, which thank God we have it, and because then there's treatment and some suffering can be alleviated, but it also ends the story. You know, it puts a neat lid on human behavior. And there's a kind of freedom in not having the medical diagnosis, but having that thought of, I wonder what made her melancholic. A doctor could come in and say, she's depressed, yeah, her father committed suicide, clearly it's hereditary, we got it, that's done, she's explained. But if you change the language, so your question is exactly what I was hoping for. Yes, clearly 21st century reader can say, oh yeah, she just is suffering from depression, as clearly her father, who was called peculiar, did. But since so much of the story takes place in those early times, I would also have, you know, the lingering proposition that life also, she witnessed something as a young woman that she could never quite get out of her head. So life and experience also has a role to play.
Yes, sir, maybe one last question.
Sure. What's the difference between books about Catholics and Catholic books?
Do you want to just repeat that answer?
The question is, what's the difference between, but there's always someone wise to ask the question, what's the difference between books about Catholics and a Catholic book? What's the difference between a book about a whale and a whaling book? I think Catholicism as an aspect of characters' experience, just as where they're born, where they're raised, all those details that storytellers need to create a world, is one thing. But a book that takes as its themes, and theme is a word that most of us are very shy about using. It smacks too much of old-fashioned English classes, and maybe a little highfalutin, you know, I have themes. But I think it takes as its theme Christianity, faith, the very idea that suffering is inevitable, and here is a proposition that takes away the unfairness of that suffering. And the proposition is that God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son. That becomes the focus, the question of the novel, rather than, there may be some individual characters in these other novels who think about things like that, but they're also just trying to get through their life. And that they go to Mass on Sunday, and not go to synagogue or to, what do Protestants call their churches? Church, right, yeah, church. You know, that's part of it, but it's not the central reason for being. When Charming Billy came out, I got one of my all-time favorite letters from a reader. And he said, after reading this book, I realized if you change all the surnames, and if you change the alcohol to high cholesterol food, this is the story of my Jewish family. Thank you again. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Alice. I don't know, Alice, have you ever heard the chat-up line in Ireland that was used in the past? How would you like, or not a chat-up line, proposal, how would you like for your people to be buried with my people? That's a good Irish proposal. Anyway, NYU bookstores downstairs selling copies of the book if any of you would like to purchase a copy. And Alice has generously offered to sign some of those, so please feel free to come downstairs, and we have some refreshments and wine and stuff downstairs, so you're more than welcome to come down. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dan.